The endgame is the most difficult part of the game to play. Precision is required, and I think what we would most benefit from is method to help us here. That's what I'm going to try and teach you. Now, I'm going to show you some simple techniques which I hope will help you to play the endgame better. Now, the first thing to realise is that the master cannot keep all the important endgames in his mind. Instead, he uses guidelines to help him work his way through the various positions he'll encounter at the board. And here for you now are those important master tips which will undoubtedly help you to improve. In this section we're going to learn about passed pawns. Now, passed pawns are the cornerstone to the endgame. They're very important because they tie the enemy down and give you carte blanche, a free hand to do exactly what you want. Virtually the whole point of any endgame is to create a passed pawn and push it. Passed pawns must be pushed. Now, we'll start off this section on passed pawns by looking at some fairly simple examples. Here's a typical example for you where both sides have 2 pawns each and it's white to move. He's about to create with his next move a passed pawn. White plays c5. Now, there are several variations here, all of which are very difficult for black. For instance, if black takes on c5, white would surely advance his pawn. And we suddenly find, after a couple of moves, that while the white king can stop black's passed pawn, the white pawn marches home. Black cannot do the same. So b takes c5 is out of the question. Black could try to rush his king across in this position, but then white wins simply with pawn takes pawn, king d7 and then a5. It's pretty clear that the white pawns are going to queen. So after c5, black's got only one move on the board to keep the game going, and that is b5. White plays a5 and hey presto, he's got his passed pawn here. Well, as you can see, the white pawn queens in 3 moves. The black king takes 4 moves to get across. So the only move black can try is b4. But whereas the white pawn is unstoppable, the black pawn can be stopped. And although it's 1 passed pawn each, by accurate play, marching his king across, white wins comfortably. So there's a typical example of white creating an outside passed pawn and winning comfortably as a result. Well, here's a second simple example for you, illustrating the power of the outside passed pawn. It's only 2 pawns each in this position, 1 passed pawn each. White's pawn on f4 is passed, black has a passed pawn on d4. But the fact is that the pawn on f4 has a much higher value in this position than the pawn on d4, because white can use it to drag the black king offside. What's going to happen over the next few moves is that white's going to push his pawn. The black king will have to come across to stop it. White gobbles black's pawn, and then the white king is nearby to the remaining black pawn, whereas black's king is a long way away. So if we play out the ending, we will see that white is going to win this one fairly comfortably. Well, black can do nothing better than to rush back. There we are, white gobbles the pawn. King c7, king a6, king b8, and now king b6. And we call this sort of situation the opposition. It's decisive opposition in this case. From white's point of view, the black king must give way, and then pushing the pawn, white finds a way of promoting the pawn fairly comfortably. The black king has to move aside, white comes in with his king, and the pawn queens. So in this case, it was the outside passed pawn that led to the win. Now, in this example, we encounter a third kind of passed pawn. This is the protected passed pawn, and it's the most powerful passed pawn of all. As you can see in this position, it's still 2 pawns each, 1 passed pawn each at the moment. There's a very powerful protected passed pawn here on b5, and black has the outside passed pawn on h7. Unfortunately, black's pawn is not enough to win the game for him. He tries to push the pawn, but whereas the white king can move across and actually gobble this pawn, the black king can't stray very far from c5, because if the black king comes forward, the white b pawn will just advance the queen. The protected passed pawn means really that your king is free to roam, whereas his king is completely tied down. And if we just play out this endgame, we'll see exactly what that means. White's king comes across, black goes as far as he can, but he suddenly finds he can't come any further. If he strays any further, the white b pawn will just advance to make a queen. So the poor old black king has to go back, and white comes across, gobbles the h pawn and wins comfortably. So the protected passed pawn is the strongest passed pawn of all. Remember that. Now here's another example for you. Despite the fact there's only 2 pawns each, this is a rather interesting one. Because with the protected passed pawn on d5, it seems as though white's actually poised to win this position. But with the help of counterplay, an accurate counterattack, black saves the day. And I guess it's something I want to emphasise very keenly on this particular video, that counterplay is the key to defence in the endgame. Well, probably at all stages of chess, the opening, middle game and endgame, counterplay is very important, but in the endgame, counterplay comes into its own. Let me show you exactly what that means. You'd think that king e4 won the game for white, wouldn't you? But with the very good move f3, sacrificing a pawn in order to decoy the white king away, and then b5, smashing up the white pawns, black actually makes a draw. This would be a typical example of a counterattack in a simplified endgame situation. As you can see in this final position, it's child's play for black to just come across and take off the remaining white pawn. So despite the protected passed pawn, white couldn't win. Draw. As a final example for you, illustrating counter-attacking methods against the passed pawn, we encounter another simplified position, 2 pawns each. White's got a protected passed pawn on b4, black an outside passed pawn on h7. And again it looks child's play for white to just march in, take the pawn off and wait for black to resign. But black manages to create a counter-attack here out of nothing. The king comes across, and now king e4. King takes h5, king d3. Well, this is very good play by black. And I'm showing this example because it's a special situation. White's can actually be allowed to queen his pawn. And if we just play the game out for a little while, nothing black can do to stop him. So black must try to get on with the business of pushing his own pawn. And under normal circumstances, you would think that white would be able to win this position. After all, he is queen for pawn ahead. But because the white king is so remote, and in this special circumstance, the black king is able to march into the corner at a certain point and create stalemating opportunities, this is actually a drawn position. Let me show you how. Well, the white queen has got to try and make some headway here, so she makes zigzag moves up the board. Attacking the pawn, black must defend. Attacking the pawn, black must defend, and now plays what looks like the killer move, queen to d3, forcing black's king in front of his own pawn, whereupon the white king makes a move towards the pawn. You would think that was all there was to it, wouldn't you? White just repeats the process, and the white king slowly comes across, forcing resignation. But let me show you now that this is a special case. Black moves out. He continues this checking sequence. White attacks the pawn. Queen b4 check, but now a very interesting move by black. King into the corner. Queen c3, king b1, queen b3, and now the king goes into the corner. And I guess white feels a bit cheated at this point, because if he takes the pawn, it's stalemate. Just so. And if he doesn't take the pawn, what does he do? The pawn will queen. Therefore, the bishop's pawn, the c or h pawn, is a special case in this instance, and I ask you to bear it in mind. It crops up quite a lot in practical play.